Thanks for joining the breakout session, Ensuring Equity in the American Rescue Plan Act, Implementing Historical Government Investments in the South. My name is Maria Filippelli, Data Director for the Southern Economic Advancement Project, or SEAP for short, and I'll also be our session moderator today. I'm excited to be joined by Kyra Roby, Policy Analyst from One Voice, Mississippi. Kyra and I originally had one more panelist, Kevin Shankar Sinha, founder of Civic Georgia. Unfortunately, Kevin had a family emergency and could not make today's panel. I did, however, leave his information and Civic Georgia's information in the slides deck in case folks wanted to check out the really great work that Civic Georgia does at a local level. A note about closed captioning. I know we're on the second session of the second day, so folks might already know this, but just I think worth reiterating, if you need closed captioning, it's the little box with the CC kind of right at the middle underneath the video screen. We also have technical support available in this session, and I know that there's a help desk if you go to the sessions tab on the left-hand side. So if you're having any technical difficulty, any accessibility difficulty, please just reach out and let us know, and we'll make it work for you. Today, we want to share some of our experiences coordinating community outreach and engagement at multiple levels of government, from the local to the state to the federal. We'll start with some highlights of the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, or ARP for short, and then I'll give a brief overview of some of the Southern Economic Advancement Project's ARP efforts. Then I'll hand it over to Kyra to introduce One Voice's ARP efforts in the state of Mississippi. After that, I have a few moderated questions, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. We do want this to be an interactive session, though, so please, at any time, if you have questions during our presentations or during the moderated Q&A, feel free to put them in the chat box. I will monitor chat and the Q&A tabs, but I think if we just maybe contain everything in the chat, it's a little bit of an easier experience so we can see all of the discussion in one place. All right, and with that, I'll get started on some American Rescue Plan highlights. The American Rescue Plan, or ARPA, was signed into law just over 1 year ago in March of 2021. The funds are being allocated in two distributions. Half of the funding was distributed in May of 2021, and half is being distributed now and over the course of the next few weeks and months. So by the end of June, all of the funds that were allocated in ARPA will be distributed directly to states, territories, municipalities, counties, and tribal governments. And that's a total of $350 billion across all these levels of governments. One really cool thing about ARPA funds is that there's a lot of flexibility in how the funding can be used. On the right-hand side of the slide, it shows kind of the four main buckets: providing government services up to the amount of revenue loss due to the pandemic, responding to COVID-19's public health impact along with its economic harms, offering additional support to workers who bear the greatest health risks because of their service in critical sectors, and providing funding to critical water and sewer projects along with high-speed broadband infrastructure. Hopefully everyone heard the message from Vice President Harris a little bit earlier today about the importance of internet access and broadband. Really loved seeing her say that and be in support of this critical infrastructure for our country. One of the most unique features of ARPA, though, is how the funds are distributed. They're going straight to all levels of government, so straight to the states, straight to the counties, straight to the local level. And this is a new type of federal funding model. And at the core of all of this work is equity and community engagement. Project guidelines reference the executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. So that's an executive order that President Biden signed on his first day in office. And that's the standard for ensuring equitable outreach and implementation of ARPA. And I'm going to read off the definitions of what equity and underserved communities mean to kind of give some additional context to today's conversation. So the term equity means the consistent and systemic, fair, just, and impartial treatment of all individuals, including individuals who belong to underserved communities that have been denied such treatment, such as Black, Latino, and Indigenous and Native persons, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and other persons of color, members of religious minorities, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer persons, persons with disabilities, persons who live in rural areas, and persons otherwise adversely affected by persistent poverty or inequality. The term underserved communities refers to populations sharing a particular characteristic, as well as geographic communities that have been systematically denied a full opportunity to participate in aspects of economic, social, and civic life, as exemplified by the list in the preceding definition of equity. So in the South, there's been a lot of inequities, a lot of substantial systemic issues to address. The South has 8 of the 10 states with the highest poverty levels. Mississippi and Louisiana are the 2 states with the greatest percentages of people below the poverty line. 19% or more of the population lives below the poverty line in these 2 states. In Louisiana, every parish, which is a county equivalent, has experienced 12 or more FEMA-declared non-COVID disasters since March 2020. So on top of the pandemic, every parish in Louisiana the past 26 months has experienced 12 or more FEMA-declared disasters, and that's far more than any other state or county in the US. The South also lacks internet access in greater proportions than the rest of the country. 31% of Southern counties have more than 1/4 of households without internet access. That's true for only 9% of counties outside of the South. Given this imbalance, all of the things that ARP offers, flexible funding, direct local funding, a focus on equity, is exciting, and it presents a lot of opportunity. It can also be challenging. Many small and local governments are experiencing capacity challenges. They didn't, at the time ARPA was signed, or still may not have the people or systems in place to execute the work. So enter the work of SEAP, One Voice Mississippi, and Civic Georgia, organizations really bridging the gap between federal funding and local implementation. SEAP, as an organization, partners with policy thinkers and doers to amplify their efforts and bridge gaps in policy infrastructure. We act as a connector, convener, and policy entrepreneur across issues in 12 Southern states. Our goal is to advance policies that improve economic security, healthcare access, and environmental justice for all Southerners. In the ARP context, we wear a few hats. We function as a regional convener. Some of the most common questions we've heard is, what are other areas doing? How are governments my size utilizing ARP funds? What are eligible uses for the funds? To help answer these questions, we developed a series of Tableau dashboards for elected officials and advocates alike to understand their community needs and to see how funds are being allocated across different government sizes and geographic locations. We provide thought leadership. In addition to creating community-based resources, SEAP regularly engages with Treasury and other federal leaders on barriers and successes of ARP implementation. And I called out Treasury there because Treasury is the agency overseeing the implementation of these funds. We also offer technical support. SEAP has created a number of grab-and-go policies, including a model resolution for towns, cities, and counties that prioritize the use of ARP funds for sustainable and equitable recovery, and a commitment to engagement and transparency. The city of New Orleans, Louisiana recently adopted this resolution. They've also committed to developing a visualization on their city's website to show the transparency in how ARP funds are being spent. We also have an equity and reporting template that local governments can use to document their outreach. All of this work and a lot more is reflected in our ARP toolkit, which is available at the SEAP.org. And now I'll turn it over to Kyra to discuss all the great work of One Voice Mississippi.
Thank you, Maria. Hi, my name is Kyra Roby. I'm a policy analyst at One Voice. One Voice is a 501c3 organization based in Jackson, Mississippi. Our mission is to ensure an equitable or equal voice to traditionally silenced communities. This mission is fueled by the belief that by building community awareness and increasing the capacity of communities, local organizations and leaders are empowered and provided opportunities to engage in the formation of public policy that affects their lives. One Voice's work with the American Rescue Plan Act, state and local fiscal recovery funds in particular, began after several concerns were made to us from elected officials about spending decisions amongst other elected officials in the state. We had, of course, been monitoring all of the federal pandemic relief aid that was coming into Mississippi over the past 2 years, but we knew that this pot of money was different. Maria has given a great overview of what ARPA means for states in the South, and it means even more for Mississippi. Along with the increased hardship experienced as a result of the pandemic, Mississippi has its fair share of challenges. Our poverty rate continues to hover around 20%, and according to the United Way's ALICE report, another 31% of Mississippians cannot afford basic household necessities. We are a state that at many times cannot seem to break away from a storied history of racial inequities, which has had a real impact on economic inequalities as well, or inequities amongst the state's residents. As a result, we see particular struggles in majority Black rural communities, like those in the Mississippi Delta, and in communities even like Jackson, our capital city, where race and politics differ from that of state leadership. From the beginning, we've, along with other groups that we partner with, encouraged state and local elected officials to use ARPA funds to target aid to those most in need, to invest in public services, and to advance equitable anti-racist policies. For us, we saw ARPA as a historic opportunity for our state government to invest in the services it's long said we can't afford, like education and healthcare. And for local communities who experienced years of disinvestment, we felt as though this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for them to control where much-needed federal aid went in their own communities. They now have a say in what their community needs and how best to fulfill those needs, with literally millions of dollars in quote-unquote extra funds. In addition to previous pandemic relief aid packages and from other ARPA provisions, ARPA state and local fiscal recovery funds have brought about $1.8 billion to the state of Mississippi's government. We've also received or will receive a total of $577 million for our counties, for our metro cities, $97 million for other cities, and $258 million for counties. Unfortunately, I think I got that bad. It's $577 million for counties, $97 million for metro cities, and $258 million for other cities. I apologize. Unfortunately, we found that, like from those earlier conversations that I mentioned, many elected officials were unaware of exactly how much money was coming into their communities. They had very little idea about what to do with the money. And no one that we talked to had actually talked to or had any conversations with their constituents about where to spend the money. So we started doing outreach through the form of presentations and meetings, aimed mostly at minority elected officials on the state and local levels, to talk about what ARPA meant in the context of previous pandemic relief aid packages, and to talk about eligible uses of the funds. And during these meetings, we always stress the importance of community engagement and investment, as well as equitable spending decisions. With the assistance of our national and regional partners like SEAP and the Center on Budget Policy Priorities, we developed materials such as reports, op-eds, blogs, and a toolkit about the funds. And many of these materials just provided a brief overview of the funds, an overview of eligible uses, and also examples of how other states and cities spent the money. We realized that many folks were interested in data sets that track spending and that were able to tell them what was kind of going on with the funds inside of Mississippi as well as outside of Mississippi. And so we continue to look for those resources and provide those resources to folks as well. We shared information with our nonprofit allies to help with our outreach efforts. And we partner with the Mississippi Civic Engagement Roundtable and the Mississippi State Conference NAACP chapters around the state to help inform community members about the money coming into their communities and to help encourage them to reach out to their elected officials to make a plan about what they wanted to talk to their elected officials about and to help make their voices heard about the needs in their community. As is the case with many of the other Southern states, this year's legislative session has not provided a ton of wins on the equity and engagement front when it comes to these funds. We've had a hard time convincing state leaders to use the money for investments that were not related to infrastructure, for instance. Any input from folks outside of state leadership has been largely non-existent. And Mississippi's budget process in particular has been very rushed and has lacked transparency. As a result, we didn't get many policy wins on the state level when it comes to these funds. During this year's legislative session, which ended in April for us, the state decided to spend about $1.5 billion of the $1.8 billion that were allotted to them. The majority of the state and local fiscal recovery funds will be used for water, sewer, and other infrastructure projects. Other plans also include money for workforce development, tourism, mental health services, child protective services, money for private colleges and university, death benefits for law enforcement and firefighters who died from COVID, and also other matters. We've made more progress on the local level in terms of education and information sharing, though. At first, there was a lot of talk about money being used to improve local community buildings, like painting the Board of Supervisors building, buying a new truck for the supervisors, or putting water fountains in different county buildings. But not to say that those things are important, but again, we wanted to try to expand the idea of what these funds were used for. We wanted to stress the importance of being able to see a return on the investment of these funds years down the road. So after a few meetings, we wanted to make sure that we go a little bit deeper with our policymakers. We've used data from other states to show local elected officials how other states have allocated funds, and that has really helped tremendously. We showed them that by the time local communities have begun planning and spending, we wanted to encourage our local elected officials to go ahead and get on the ball with doing that. They were encouraged by some members of leadership on the state level to kind of wait to spend the funds. And we wanted them to understand that there were really immediate needs of the community members now. And we wanted them to be able to use the funds to address these immediate needs as well as plan for future needs of their communities. And then through our partnership with SEAP, we've been able to show data from different cities throughout the state about what Mississippi residents really want. And that has been really, really important for us. And it's been a really good tool for us to use in talking to our local elected officials. We found out that advocacy organizations had their own wants. Of course, our policymakers had their own wants and ideas of how the money should be spent. And then, of course, community members had their own needs. And so the data that SEAP has provided has kind of helped us pull together all of those different wants and needs to be able to help encourage our local elected officials to make solid plans that address all of those things. But there's still a lot of work for us to do, and a lot of our future work will center around providing technical assistance to our local communities. We've seen a lot of concerns about reporting guidelines. A lot of our officials are afraid to get in trouble in terms of audits and those types of things. And we've seen, and we think that plays into why a lot of the local elected officials are playing it safe in terms of their spending decisions. Another thing that we've seen is that we've seen groups using consultants and law firms to help them make plans and decide on what is an eligible use for the funds. And we think by using those kind of outside groups that it's really aided in kind of the neglect of some of these plans to include the needs and wants of the communities. And so we're trying to help with that as well. So all in all, we are continuing to strengthen our engagement around the state, and we are committed to ensuring that equitable uses of the funds and spending decisions based on the needs of the people help to increase the opportunity for all of the state's residents. And so I'm happy to be on this panel today, or in this conversation today. I'm happy that you all were able to join, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kyra. One Voice Mississippi has done so much work over the past year or so. Okay, we do have a question already in the chat, and I think it kind of complements what I'm going to ask you first. So we'll kind of maybe do both at the same time. So just kind of backing up a little bit from where we are today and thinking about a year, 14 months ago when the funds were first being signed into law and communities were starting to think about potentially how the funds could be spent and the eligible uses. It seems like in your intro remarks, there were a few sort of steps to engagement. So one was just, hey, we need to have general information sessions, like what are these funds? How can they be used? And then there are two sort of different audiences. And I'm curious about if there are any specific like strategies or tactics that were different when you were speaking to elected officials versus when you were speaking to community leaders and advocates. And I think that kind of potentially gets to Fran's question too, like as you're thinking about advocacy partners, who sort of became your closest advocacy partners from that outreach?
Yeah, so all of it was kind of interesting. Like I said, it started really during a lunch with an elected official about a totally different topic. And he had been in contact with a lot of our elected officials, particularly in the Mississippi Delta, and a lot of our minority elected officials who were talking about spending ARPA money on things like I talked about, like on water fountains or updates to the county buildings. And we were really concerned with the amount of money that was coming in. It really seemed as though when we started kind of asking around that a lot of policymakers didn't really have a good understanding about what was happening in their own community. Some of the information that they did have, like I said, we weren't quite sure if it was as reliable, or we couldn't really tell who they were talking to, and so we just felt the need to kind of get in there and give them like a full picture of what was going on. One of the first meetings that I attended was a meeting with the Mississippi Association of Supervisors, Minority Supervisors Caucus, and it was really just a brief overview about what ARPA was, about some of the previous pandemic relief aid that was coming into the state. And a little bit after that, we got into a discussion about all of the eligible uses of the funds. And just from them hearing some of the examples of other states, because as I mentioned, a lot of our elected officials were encouraged to wait, to not spend the money very fast. And so by then we had examples from other states about what they were doing with the funds. And so once they heard about some of the eligible uses, we could see kind of their minds opening up and them thinking more about the needs of their community. And we tried to frame it in that way instead of kind of seeing this big kind of, oh, this is lots of money, we have all this reporting to do about it. Kind of think of it the other way, like what are the needs of our community? What would we like to address? And then just using the money to do that. So it wasn't, as big and as scary for them to kind of deal with. And then once we kind of got through that phase, we saw that a lot of folks just really needed more help in terms of kind of what to do next. So we kind of got their mind going about expanding the use of the funds, but there was kind of like, okay, what do we do now kind of thing. And so we went back in to kind of revisit with some of these groups about kind of what their plans were to talk to them about community engagement. And at that time is when we started bringing community members in, because we realized that if community members wanted to get into the conversation, they were going to have to insert themselves. We couldn't necessarily wait for the elected officials to bring them in. And we saw that planning decisions were being made, but we were encouraging community members to go ahead and make plans, because as long as the money had not been allocated or appropriated yet, we still felt as though they had time to influence their elected officials. And so we kind of switched gears and went back to the community and talked to them. So we did have some community members who were able to kind of make plans, but then that kind of gets you into another part is, doing real work with them to make sure that they know how to present those plans in a board meeting, for instance, or how to get on the agenda with the city council. And so we were thinking about how to do that. And that's kind of when SEAP came in, and we put together the toolkit, and we made sure that the toolkit that we have for Mississippi was as thorough and as helpful as possible in terms of like steps 1, 2, 3 in terms of community engagement, and in terms of spelling out the disparities, and in terms of recognizing the actual needs of the community, and kind of backing up what the community was saying by the Treasury guidance, so that the elected officials aren't afraid to listen to the community with fear of getting in trouble with reporting guidelines and staying within those uses. And so that has kind of been the arc of our work. And now we realize that we do need to do more hands-on technical assistance with local communities, like just going in and writing down the plans for them and helping them do it in that way. And so that is kind of the way that the work has progressed. Some of our closest partners, so the One Voice is actually born out of work from the Mississippi State Conference, NAACP. And so we are lucky in that being kind of this policy advocacy organization and being able to meet the needs of the community, we have a group of partners that are kind of there and ready for us, which include the Mississippi NAACP chapters that are in the majority of the state's 82 counties. I think they're in over 70 of the state's 82 counties. So we're able to really reach them pretty quickly, and they're ready to be mobilized fairly quickly as well. We also engage with the Mississippi Civic Engagement Roundtable, which is a group of organizations, faith-based leaders, business leaders who have been meeting for, I think, over 10 years. And we were able to insert the American Rescue Plan work into the Civic Engagement Roundtable work. So in terms of being able to share information quickly with folks and getting that spread through various parts of the state. The other thing is that Mississippi has a fairly close-knit group of nonprofit partners as well, and allies who meet regularly. And we've used those meetings as well, and through that kind of informal coalition to help provide information to our nonprofit partners, and that they were able to spread information to their networks. And so those were our first group of partners. And then as far as with our elected officials, as I mentioned, we started with a lot of the minority caucuses, because again, we felt in a state like Mississippi, these were some of the communities who had experienced years of disinvestment when it came to federal funds or even state funds too. And so we wanted to ensure that they got the information from a group that they were able to trust and rely upon, and that we were able to go a little bit deeper with them and provide them with some of the technical assistance that they may need outside of some of the help that they were getting from the planning and development districts or some of those guys as well. And so having information about ARPA from a community perspective, I think really helped with those elected officials.
That's great. Thank you. So it sounds like there was a lot of leveraging existing networks that are already out there kind of doing advocacy and community engagement work, and kind of bridging what the community needs, or maybe some challenges or barriers they have, and kind of really letting elected officials know that, and then sort of making a plan to kind of say, okay, here's the elected officials we want to target. Here's how and why we're going to target them and the message that we're going to let them know about ARP funds. I do want to go back to maybe one of your points in that response where you were talking about policymakers, some policymakers not really understanding community needs, and just take a second, moderator's privilege, to talk about a survey that SEAP did, which I think helped your work and it's helped the work in a couple states. And so SEAP wanted to help community leaders and electeds kind of understand what community needs might be, because we all had our experiences during the pandemic, and our challenges, and our communities experienced the pandemic in sometimes very similar ways, sometimes very different ways. And so SEAP wanted to understand how some of the potentially most underserved communities, what challenges those folks were having during the pandemic. And so we went through the Propel app. We targeted food insecure households in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and the city of New Orleans. And we, through that app, asked a survey, and we kind of said, what were your personal challenges during the pandemic? What are your community challenges? How would you like funds to be spent? And also, because we thought there might be this gap of like our elected officials reaching out, have you heard about ARP? We asked about, if they've heard of it, if any elected official had reached out. And then unfortunately, it was confirmed that a lot of folks really weren't hearing about ARP funds or any forms of community engagement. It was like 88 to 90% of all the responses. And we had about 4,000 responses to the survey, and we're still collecting them, but we kind of ran this active promotion from November through the end of January. And so really found out like a lot of folks in underserved communities really weren't hearing about it. And so we use that as a tool to reach out to groups like Kyra's and others in the other states to kind of show like, hey, here's sort of a use case. We know that there were existing systemic inequities in your state. Here's what we heard from food insecure households about their challenges and where they'd like the funds to be spent. And then we also have some information at the kind of sub-state level, how dollars were being allocated. So advocates and electeds, again, advocates and electeds could both kind of see like where there was potentially a mismatch in funds. And so always great to hear that survey is helpful for people, because it was really has a lot of robust information, and we continue to kind of learn from it and hear different experiences. So I don't know if you have any other tools that maybe kind of bridge the gap. The survey was just one that we did. So we had the survey, and then we kind of took that and put it into one-pagers. Because as much as there's people like me who just sort of love to read survey results and will look at any sort of charts and data all day long, but that's not always sort of the best, the easiest story to tell. So we kind of created one-pagers and use cases that discussed the results of the survey and some more qualitative information as well. So there is a couple of questions in the chat. And so one is about the process with Treasury to approve state spending approvals. I asked, since I heard that Alabama would like to spend their ARPA funds on building new prisons, if you know more about that, I'd love to hear both of your thoughts and reactions. That has definitely brought up some, all right, I mean, maybe just to kind of take a step back in case folks don't know. So the funds that were allocated to the state of Alabama, Governor Ivey has a proposal, I mean, very, very much like the question says, just to build more prisons. And so there are people and groups on the ground challenging that. I don't know today, right now, where it stands with Treasury. SEAP tends to work at the sub-state level, so I'm not keeping 100% tabs on that. I don't think it's fully approved, but I mean, don't quote me on that, because I haven't checked any news in the past few days about that one. And Kyra, I don't know if you have any more info, but
No, I think, from our end too, what we have always heard was that, the funds are very flexible. And we see a lot of states kind of go into these infrastructure projects. And I think the building of the prison has kind of been grouped into one of those kind of infrastructure projects that may be able to kind of fit in. But I think we don't really know yet. I think in Mississippi, we were questioning kind of the same thing because there's a part within the Treasury guidance that says that the funds can't be used to basically, I'm simplifying this, but to support tax cuts or, to support net revenue losses from tax cut plans. In this legislative session, the state passed the largest tax cut for the wealthy in the history of the state. And so, we are waiting to see as well kind of how the guidance will be enforced and what that looks like for some of the states, especially where we see these very kind of inequitable kind of practices coming about, which would include the prison. So I think that we don't know the complete answer to that, but I think some of that might go into kind of what the enforcement mechanisms of the federal government would be in terms of how states have decided to use those funds and how they interpret the guidelines.
Thank you.
Yeah, but we definitely use Alabama as an example of what we did not want Mississippi to do. So I think that was the first time that in a little while that we would be like, we're not the worst in terms of what we're doing right now. Here's an example of somebody that's doing a little bit worse. So I'm interested to see how that plays out.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are interested to see how that one plays out. So next question here from Fran, what do you think the most impactful projects that you've seen get funded? Have you seen any local governments braid their ARP funds with state ARP funds? So I think, yeah, Kara, I don't know if you want to go first. I have a couple of thoughts on that, but I actually had a very similar question for you too, because I know that we sometimes get this question, like what are the best ways to kind of work across levels of government? Because I think there's a lot of like tracking what states are doing or tracking what counties are doing, and I haven't seen too many sort of across government level coordination.
So from the very beginning, Mississippi, or at least on the state level, was always interested in matching the water and sewer infrastructure funds with counties, which would have taken a large chunk of the fund allocations. And so it wasn't something that we were necessarily opposed to, but we thought that it might be problematic, especially for some of our smaller cities or for some of our smaller counties, if they were kind of forced to use a good portion of their funds in order to get the state match. And so we were kind of concerned about that. But that is the only kind of state and local kind of braiding that we've seen. We try to encourage some kind of collaboration between state and local officials, specifically like on policy issues regarding education, because our school system our public education system is so severely underfunded. It has only been fully funded twice since the formula to decide whether it's fully funded was created in 1997. And so we were pushing for cities and counties, or the cities to collaborate with the counties, to collaborate with the state on some of those type investments, because we thought that the money could have gone a little bit farther or a lot farther, and especially in some of these communities where they felt as though the state had disinvested in them, or where, for instance, the property values were lower, which kind of determines a portion of the school funding here in the state, that it would be able to kind of supplement some of that work. But that's the only thing that we've seen. We've been interested again in some of the education and healthcare policies, again, just because those were policies that the advocacy community has been advocating for so long, the full funding of education in Mississippi and Medicaid expansion. And we were hoping to leverage the timing of the ARPA funds with some of the higher state revenue collections and with some of the big policy issues that we knew were coming up during this legislative session to kind of convince lawmakers to look at some of these issues, since they said that we haven't had money to do that in so long. We've also been interested in seeing some of the uses of the funds to address criminal justice reform issues. That's another big one that we've been interested in doing. I don't know of any places in Mississippi that has gone kind of far enough to kind of do that. But some of these youth intervention programs and those kind of things are other things that we have been interested in. But again, from the SEAP survey, communities are saying that they need help with affordable housing and utilities and those types of things. So we've been pushing our local governments to do more in that arena as well, in terms of like cleaning up vacant housing. We've seen some examples of those from other cities and states, to having, utility assistance programs and those kind of things. And so those are some of the uses that have kind of stood out to us a little bit more, but I don't have like a particular example from the city that we can tell so far has kind of played out, again, because our local elected officials have been pushing, or our state officials have been pushing local elected officials to kind of wait to make planning decisions. And even on the state level, we just got the plan the last 2 weeks of our legislative session, which, like I said, ended the first week in April. So we haven't really seen the full implementation of any of the plans that have been set forth yet.
Yeah, I think it's also worth noting the timeline on ARPA funds. So yes, the second distribution is happening now, so governments will have all of their funds available to them. But I don't think they have like another year or two, I think through 2024 maybe, to actually implement. So sometimes they're just being allocated to buckets, like, hey, here's water and infrastructure or education. But sort of how the implementation plays out, there's still some time to make those decisions. And then in all funds, so there's still like 2 more years for allocations, and then beyond that, another 2 years for actually spending them. So governments have until 2026 to actually spend the funds. So even though things are allocated now, there's still like a lot of time for advocacy and interventions and really making sure that the work is done in an equitable way. And thanks for calling out the survey. I was going to say the same thing. We found in the survey, the SEAP survey that we did, at a personal level, there was the challenges with paying utility bills and rent and kind of personal debt were really, really top challenges that folks had during the pandemic. And then the biggest challenge for the community is affordable housing. So finding and maintaining affordable housing. And then affordable housing is also where community members wanted funds to be spent. So not only was like, yes, we recognize this as a community challenge, and that's where we would want to see money invested and implementations being made is kind of in its bucket of affordable housing. And so we've seen a lot of local governments, again, SEAP does a lot of the sub-state level, so I can't speak to states too much, but states overall. But at the local level, we've seen municipalities and metro areas allocating funds to affordable housing, to programs that help the unhoused get housed, and some of those like transition type programs. So it is good to see that. And then still a lot remains to be seen on what gets funding. And then too, I think it's also worth doing, Kyra, a lot of what you mentioned where you were looking to have funds being spent, or where you were advocating for funds being spent, and really are these systemic issues. It's equity in education, making sure that that's fully funded, Medicaid expansion so everybody can have healthcare, criminal justice reform, like all of these longstanding institutions and systems that have historically just disadvantaged people of color and underserved communities. So really, really investing in those is the sort of spirit of what ARPA is for. Like, yes, pandemic, and also let's kind of make these long-standing investments.
Yeah, Maria, I like to add, just kind of put it in context of kind of some of the challenges that you run into. And so, like I said, those were some of the things that we were looking at and we were interested in as an organization in a larger policy community. And then, like I said, one of the coalitions that we worked with, they had actually gotten some bills sponsored that centered around broadband and premium pay. And those were some of the big issues that they were pushing on the state level, or we as an advocacy community is pushing on the state level. But then we run into the issue of our state legislatures where they were advocating for something not completely different, but they had interest kind of in other things outside of what kind of the advocacy and policy community was saying, and then outside of what our survey was saying. And so they were working behind the scenes to get deals on particular things. And so you do run into these challenges about people kind of wanting vastly different outcomes in terms of the funding, and then working a lot of times, like I said, with a rush timeline. Our appropriations process in our state legislature occurred like over a weekend, and we had an additional like $4.2 billion outside of what we would normally have to budget. And so all of that got done within like a weekend here in the state. So we're up against a rush timeline on the state level about kind of making these decisions. And then on a local level as well, you see all of these interests kind of come about and trying to see like whose voice gets heard the most. But we knew for sure having no community engagement or no community output was kind of like a non-negotiator, a non-starter for us. And so we just wanted to make sure that we focus on getting those voices out to the forefront outside of kind of what we wanted to see.
That's great. And I think that starts to answer the next question that we have. So that's, I'm curious to learn more about your approach to relationship building with new equity partners. What is your approach to helping ensure mutual knowledge sharing and trust?
I'm not sure if this quite answers the question. Let me know if it doesn't. What we tried to do, or what the approach that we tried to take was, again, we knew that this would be kind of a historic year for the state of Mississippi with all of the pandemic funding that was going on. There is some other context to be given in terms of we had a ballot initiative process that was kind of undone over the summer. We had hearings in the summer on eliminating our state income tax. We passed the last state to pass an equal pay law this session, even though it's not it's not what we wanted. So there were just a range of issues that our legislature, we saw a lot of states kind of take on ARPA during the summer, have a special session, but ARPA was kind of lumped into all of these other things that we had going on. So one of the things that we tried to do was to include this outreach into existing policy issues that other groups were focusing on. So if we saw groups, focus on like childcare or focus on health or focus on education, or some of the groups that were doing housing outreach in regards to the other pockets of ARPA money, our goal was to try to loop ARPA into what they were already doing, because we knew that there was so much that our legislature had to kind of go over this legislative session on the local level. In terms of that approach, we started with the heads of some of our local elected, our local organizations, like the Minority Supervisors Organization. We have like a municipal league here. We have an organization for mayors. And even through some of the planning and development districts, we weren't able to reach all of those, but we tried to kind of start at the top and where folks were already having conversations about it, to jump into the conversation, but to jump of it into not like I'm telling you what to do, but more of like, by the way, the importance of this money is to address disparities and to get community engagement kind of thing, which is something that some of these larger organizations or some of these other folks that were having these conversations did not mention. And so we kind of went in it from that angle. And we tried to reference the Treasury guidelines as much as possible to help build trust. Because again, what people have been hearing had been different from kind of what we had been hearing as an advocacy organization about how the money could be spent. And so I don't know if that necessarily helps answer, but that's the approach that we took to try to help build trust. But luckily, again, One Voice has kind of that grassroots capacity right now to where we had kind of trusted voices and communities that we could go to and have these conversations. And luckily, a lot of times elected officials happen to be in those rooms already. And so we were able to kind of start there and build our way out.
That's great. So kind of leveraging or incorporating into other policy areas because there is so much overlap.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to give a bit of a different response to that question, largely because I'm a data director. So my job is to curate data, to collect data, to analyze data. And I know people consume data in different ways. So when it comes to the work that I do for SEAP and kind of thinking about equity and knowledge sharing and trust, I really try to, when SEAP creates resources, think about awareness, accessibility, and representation. So I never want to just throw a dashboard out there and just leave it and hope that people will come. And so when we did the survey, when we put up new tools or dashboards, we often have trainings around them. We reach out to our partners to kind of show them how to navigate the dashboards and then take their feedback. We've had feedback about, not having enough languages, because right now all of our resources, unfortunately, are only in English. And so it's we're investigating ways to have those resources available in other languages. And we're working on some videos now that will definitely have closed captioning and potentially alt text and kind of those accessibility features. So that way we're creating resources and thinking about equity in the development of resources that way. So, okay. I think all right, we have one more question in the chat. Okay, so each state has its own unique culture and values. Did you encounter that in decision-making process for allocations? If so, how did you account for that in your work? Yeah. Yes, you're right. There's definitely different sort of approaches and existing networks in, I'd say whatever sort of government structure. So not just at the state level, but at counties and metro areas and rural areas. It really does vary depending on your geographic scale and location. But I think one of the most important things Kyra mentioned in her previous answer is really working with the trusted voices that exist in the community already. And so if you know those trusted voices, if you didn't have a relationship with them previously, slowly building that relationship, just sort of start with an intro meeting, start with sharing resources, start with maybe doing a small project together, whether that's an op-ed or a fact sheet or something like that, and really start to build out that relationship so that then you become a trusted voice with that community. And then it kind of helps that relationship. Then, you're sort of relied upon as that bridge between whether it's the Treasury or maybe it's other governments of the same size. And you really become that bridge figure that's needed when it comes to, understanding ARP allocations. Kyra, I don't know if you have any more to add on that, but
yeah, without getting too critical or too political in terms of kind of what's been going on here in Mississippi. So on the state level, we had different factions of conservatives kind of deciding, having different opinions about policy issues. And that was something that we kind of had not really experienced to the point on some policy issues. Some folks were kind of let's just kind of back off and see what they kind of come up with. We don't really want to get into the fight if if they're fighting. And kind of, again, we know that, as a bipartisan organization, we were kind of watching what was going on with some of the state's top leadership that held a supermajority. And so some of the policy issues that we would normally kind of advocate for, we just kind of found ourselves kind of sitting back and watching what would happen instead of kind of directly engaging on some of the policy issues outside of ARPA. And so that was something that we had to account for. Another thing that was kind of going on as well is in terms of our metro cities, we don't have a lot, but there was a lot of talk because the census results came out too a little bit before all of that. And Mississippi, of course, lost population. And so there was a lot of talk too around the same time about how to stop the brain drain in Mississippi, how to keep folks in the state and things like that. And then there was a lot of attention going on in terms of our capital city, in terms of dealing with crime and dealing with their own infrastructure problems during the winter. We had an ice storm, and across the state, we were kind of shut down for like a week because we just didn't have the infrastructure to deal with it. But in the capital city, folks lost water for like months. And so the city had, is on kind of issues that they needed help with around the time that these spending or planning decisions were being made. And some of our other metro cities were kind of dealing with opposite issues, that they were kind of growing in some ways in different parts of the state. And so again, we had to kind of go through and shift through some of the communities or groups of folks in terms of, and you think about in terms of addressing disparities, like who this money would really help. And those kind of things. And so, but there was a lot of context behind that. There's a lot of political context behind all of that. And so akin to some of the other fights that we were having, we were trying to say affordable housing isn't a political issue. Roads and bridges aren't a political issue. Affordable health care or helping people with healthcare and education aren't political issues. And so there was a lot of that we had to work with, and a lot of power struggles that we had to account for as well on the state and local level. Marie, I think we're on mute.
I hit share screen instead of unmute. Thank you for that response. Yeah, and sometimes it's you have to remember that there's other issues going on. I know I get tunnel vision with ARP sometimes, and I'm like, look at all the good stuff, and then it's like, oh yeah, there's also all these other lives and all of these other issues and intersections happening. And so that is good to know.
That's why we try to focus on community engagement and addressing disparities. So
yeah, so we are just about at time. So I think, Kyra, I don't know if you have any last thoughts. I'm just going to put up our last slide in case folks want to see our websites or take like a screenshot or any of that good stuff. Our names are on there, our org's websites. For more information, feel free to reach out, I think, to either of us. Always happy to answer questions and have other folks engage on this work. And then, yeah, Kyra, I'll leave the last word for you.
Oh, no, I hope, thank you all for joining this panel. I hope that it's been informative. And I hope that, I wish you all luck in your states and kind of advocating for the equitable uses of spending decisions or funding from the American Rescue Plan funds. And I hope you all have a good luck in terms of getting communities involved in addressing those disparities that we talked about. And feel free to reach out to connect.